He simply parked his old Ford Bronco in his own driveway, and somehow, that was enough to get the police called. The first thing I noticed wasn't the flashing lights. It was the sound. Tires crunching slow over gravel, one after another, like a line of dominoes clicking into place. Then came the lights, red and blue washing over my garage door, reflecting off the faded chrome of my Bronco like it was some kind of crime scene. I was still holding my coffee when I stepped out onto the porch, the smell of motor oil and last night's rain hanging in the air, trying to figure out how parking in my own driveway had turned into this. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 38, been working with my hands most of my life. Engines, transmissions, anything that hums, rattles, or breaks down. Took me 12 years to save up for this house. 12 years of overtime, skipped vacations, and cold mornings under hoods that didn't want to open. That driveway, it wasn't just concrete. It was proof that I finally had something that was mine. No landlord. No shared space. No one telling me where I could or couldn't park. At least, that's what I thought. The Bronco had been with me longer than anything else I owned. 92 model. Faded red. A little rust along the wheel wells. Engine rebuilt twice with my own hands. It wasn't pretty, but it was honest. And every evening, like clockwork, I'd pull it into my driveway, kill the engine, and listen to that last soft tick of cooling metal before heading inside. Routine. Simple. Mine. That was before Linda Harper decided it wasn't. You ever meet someone who smiles like they're doing you a favor, while quietly rearranging your life behind your back? That's Linda, HOA president. Mid-50s, always dressed like she's heading to a meeting no one invited you to. Clipboard in one hand, phone in the other, walking the neighborhood like she owned every inch of it. First time she came over, she didn't even knock. Just stood at the edge of my driveway, heels clicking against the concrete, staring at the Bronco like it had personally offended her. That vehicle, she said, voice sweet enough to rot teeth, doesn't really align with community standards. I remember wiping my hands on a rag, still smelling like grease, and thinking she was joking. She wasn't. That was the start. Little things at first. Notes on my door. Emails about aesthetic consistency. A warning about how my driveway was visually disruptive when the Bronco was parked at an angle she didn't approve of. I checked the HOA bylaws. Then the city code. Twice. There was nothing that said I couldn't park my own vehicle in my own driveway. So I kept doing exactly that. Every day, same spot, same routine. And every time, I could feel her watching. Not openly, not confrontational, just there. Curtains shifting, phone in hand, like she was waiting for something, like she needed me to cross a line that didn't exist. And this morning, I guess she decided to draw one herself. I had just parked, engine off, coffee still warm in my hand. The air had that quiet, early morning stillness. No traffic, just a distant lawn sprinkler ticking somewhere down the street. Then I heard her voice. Sharp, urgent, talking fast. I turned slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of her across the sidewalk, phone pressed tight to her ear, eyes locked on me like she'd been waiting for this moment all week. Yes, she said, pacing now, heels striking concrete in quick, precise beats. He's blocking access. It's intentional. Blocking access. I looked at my driveway, then back at her, then at my driveway again. That's when I realized she wasn't calling to complain. She was calling the police. And suddenly, that quiet morning air didn't feel so quiet anymore. The dispatcher must have still been on the line because Linda kept talking, pacing tighter circles now, her voice rising just enough to cut through the quiet street. Yes, he is obstructing shared access, and I have told him multiple times, she said, stressing each word like she was building a case brick by brick. I leaned against the side of my Bronco, the metal still warm against my arm, and took a slow sip of coffee, letting it sit on my tongue for a second longer than usual. There is a moment in situations like this where you can feel things tipping, like a balance shifting just enough that you know whatever comes next is not going back to normal. That moment had been building for weeks. It started small, like everything with Linda. The first note had been folded neatly and tucked under my windshield wiper. Please be mindful of vehicle presentation, it said, printed in that generic HOA font that tries to sound friendly but feels like a warning. I remember standing there in my driveway, early morning light hitting the hood, reading it twice just to make sure I was not missing something. It was my driveway, my vehicle. No blocked sidewalks, no street parking, No violations. Just my truck sitting where it had always sat. I shrugged it off. Figured it was one of those things you ignore and it goes away. It did not go away. A week later, there was an email. Then another. Then a letter. This one in an envelope with the HOA letterhead. Heavier paper like that somehow made it more official. Words like non-compliant visual impact and community harmony started showing up, phrases that sound important until you realize they do not actually mean anything you can enforce. I printed out the HOA bylaws that night at my kitchen table, pages spread out next to a cold cup of coffee, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house. I went line by line. Parking rules, vehicle restrictions, property use. There was nothing about driveway positioning, nothing about older vehicles, nothing that gave anyone the authority to tell me how to use the space I paid for. Just to be sure, I pulled up the city code on my phone. Same result. Clear as day. Private driveway, private use. No obstruction. No violation. That should have been the end of it. It was not. Linda escalated in the way people do when they are convinced they are right. She stopped leaving notes and started showing up in person. Always unannounced. Always standing just far enough back to pretend she was not stepping onto my property. You have to understand, she told me one afternoon, sunglasses perched on her head, clipboard tucked against her side. These things affect everyone. Property values, neighborhood perception. I remember looking at her, then at my house, then back at her, trying to figure out how a 30-year-old Bronco parked in a clean driveway was suddenly a threat to an entire neighborhood. It is my driveway, I said, keeping my voice even. I am not blocking anything. Her smile tightened just a fraction. That is your opinion. That was the first time I realized this was not about rules. It was about control. After that, the pattern became predictable. I would park. She would watch. Sometimes from her porch, sometimes from behind the slight movement of blinds. Once, I caught her taking pictures. Not even hiding it. Just standing there with her phone up, framing my Bronco like it was evidence of something. I started documenting everything after that. Not out of anger, just clarity. Dates, times, copies of emails, photos of where my vehicle sat in the driveway. Not because I planned to use it, but because something about the way she kept pushing told me eventually I might need to. And now here we were. Her voice still cutting through the morning air, the word blocking repeated like it would become true if she said it enough times. In the distance, I heard it before I saw it. A low hum building into something more distinct. Engines. Multiple. Coming closer. Linda stopped pacing for a second, a small, satisfied pause, like she had just set something in motion that could not be undone. I set my coffee down on the hood, straightened up, and looked down at the line where my driveway met the street. Still clear. Still mine. The hum turned into the unmistakable sound of tires slowing, doors opening, radios crackling faintly. And just like that, what should have been a quiet morning in my own driveway had turned into something official. The doors opened almost in sync, that solid, heavy thud you only hear from patrol cars, followed by the soft crackle of radios adjusting to movement. Two officers stepped out first, one older, maybe late 40s, steady posture, the kind of presence that fills space without trying, and the other younger, sharper movements, eyes already scanning the scene like he was piecing together a story before anyone spoke. I stayed where I was, one hand resting lightly on the Bronco, the other hanging loose at my side, keeping everything slow. Visible, simple. Linda moved first. Of course she did. Her heels clicked faster now, a quick, eager rhythm as she crossed the sidewalk toward them, phone still in her hand like proof of something important. Officers, she said, voice shifting instantly, softer but urgent, thank you for coming. This is exactly what I was telling dispatch about. The older officer gave a small nod, calm, measured. Ma'am, what seems to be the issue today? She gestured toward me without even looking, like I was just part of the background. He is blocking access. This driveway connects visually to the shared entrance, and it creates confusion and potential obstruction. I watched the officer's eyes flick briefly from her to me, then down to the driveway, then back again. That pause told me everything. He was not seeing what she was describing. Sir, he said, turning to me, voice even. Can you tell me what is going on from your side? I took a breath, slow and steady, the faint smell of coffee still lingering in the air between us. I parked my vehicle in my driveway, I said. No extra words. No explanation layered on top. Just the truth, clean and simple. The younger officer shifted his weight slightly, glancing at the front of the Bronco, then at the curb line, then back at Linda. You could almost see the checklist running in his head. Sidewalk clear. Street clear. No emergency access blocked. Nothing even close. Linda stepped in again before the silence could settle. It is not just about blocking physically, she said, her tone tightening. It is about compliance and maintaining community standards. I have addressed this multiple times. The older officer held up a hand gently, not dismissive, just enough to slow her down. Ma'am, I understand you have concerns, but right now I need to determine if there is any legal obstruction or violation. That word, legal, hung in the air differently. You could feel the shift. Linda hesitated for half a second, just enough to notice. Well, she said, adjusting her stance, it violates our HOA guidelines. The officer nodded once, acknowledging, but not agreeing. HOA guidelines are civil matters, he said calmly. We are here to address potential public safety or legal issues. I did not move, did not interrupt. I just let it play out. That was the moment everything slowed down for me, like the world pulled back just enough to see the whole picture. Weeks of notes, emails, conversations, all of it leading right here to a simple question of what actually mattered. The younger officer stepped a little closer to the edge of the driveway, looking down the line where concrete met asphalt, then back up at me. Vehicle is fully within your property line? He asked. Yes, sir, I said. Always is. He nodded, then glanced at his partner. The older officer turned back to Linda, his expression still calm, but firmer now. Ma'am, I am not seeing any violation here. The vehicle is parked on private property, not obstructing the roadway or any public access. Linda's smile flickered, just for a second. It was small, but it was there. But it affects, she started, then stopped herself, searching for a word that would land. It affects the neighborhood. The officer's voice did not change, but there was a finality to it now. That may be something to address through your association, but it is not a police matter. Silence settled in, heavier this time. Not the quiet of mourning, but the kind that follows when something expected does not happen. Linda looked from the officer to me, then back again, like she was trying to find a different angle, a different way to frame it. I did not say anything. I just stood there, exactly where I had been from the start, next to the same Bronco, in the same driveway. And for the first time since all of this started, she did not have the room to redefine what was happening. For a second, I thought that would be the end of it. The officers had said their piece, clear and simple, and you could feel the tension in the air starting to loosen, like a knot finally giving way. The younger officer stepped back toward his car, already reaching for the radio clipped to his shoulder, while the older one gave me a small nod, the kind that says everything is understood without needing more words. But Linda did not move. She just stood there on the edge of my driveway, her posture stiff. Her smile stretched thin like it was holding together something that was starting to crack. So that is it? She asked, her voice tighter now, less polished than before. He can just do whatever he wants? The officer paused, turning back slightly, patient but firm. Ma'am, he is using his property within the law. That is what matters here. That should have been enough. For most people, it would have been. But Linda was not most people. She took a step closer, not quite onto my driveway, but close enough that it felt like she was testing an invisible line. This is exactly the problem, she said, more to the officers than to me. People think they can ignore community standards, and then everything starts to fall apart. I watched her carefully then, really watched her, not as the person who had been leaving notes or sending emails, but as someone who genuinely believed what she was saying. To her, this was not about a truck. It was about control disguised as order, about drawing lines where none existed and expecting everyone else to follow them. The older officer did not raise his voice, did not change his tone, but there was a quiet finality in what he said next. Community standards do not override the law. If there is no violation, there is nothing for us to enforce. That word again, enforce. It landed heavier this time. Linda opened her mouth like she was going to argue, then stopped. You could see it, that moment where the argument runs out of ground to stand on. The younger officer glanced between us, then added, if you have concerns with your association, you might want to handle that through your HOA board or legal channels, not emergency services. There was no judgment in his voice, just a statement of fact. But facts have a way of cutting through things that opinions cannot. Linda's grip tightened slightly on her phone. Not enough to be dramatic, just enough that her knuckles lost a bit of color. She looked at me then, really looked, for the first time that morning, not past me, not through me, but directly at me. I did not say anything. I did not need to. Everything that needed to be said had already been said by people whose authority actually mattered. The officers started to wrap up, one of them speaking briefly into the radio, the other giving a final glance down the driveway, like he was double-checking something that had already been clear from the start. "You are all set, sir," he said to me. "Have a good day." "You too," I replied, keeping my voice steady, normal, like this was just another morning. Because in a way it was. Just not in the way anyone expected. The doors of the patrol cars closed again, that same solid sound as before, engines turning over, lights dimming as they pulled away one by one. The red and blue reflections faded off the Bronco, leaving behind the same quiet street, the same driveway, the same truck sitting exactly where it had been the whole time. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. Linda stood there, the energy that had been driving her all morning suddenly gone, like a motor that had been cut off mid-spin. The neighborhood felt different now, not louder or quieter, just clearer. Boundaries had been drawn, not by opinion, not by assumption, but by something real. I reached for my coffee, now just warm instead of hot, and took another sip, the bitterness settling in a way that felt grounding. "You might want to read the city code," I said finally, not sharp, not confrontational, just plain. "It is all in there." She did not respond, just stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked back toward her house, heels clicking slower this time, each step sounding a little less certain than before. And just like that, the driveway was mine again. Not because it had changed, but because for the first time, she understood that it never stopped being mine in the first place. The street went back to normal faster than I expected. Within minutes, the last patrol car had disappeared around the corner, the low hum of its engine fading into the distance, replaced by the usual suburban soundtrack, sprinklers ticking, a dog barking 2 houses down, the faint whir of someone's garage door opening. But something had shifted, and you could feel it if you paid attention. Not in the air, not in the noise, in the way people looked. Curtains that had been slightly parted during the whole scene were now closing slower than usual. A neighbor across the street stood by his mailbox a little longer than necessary, pretending to sort envelopes that did not need sorting. No one said anything, but everyone had seen it. And more importantly, everyone had heard it. I stayed where I was for a while, finishing my coffee, letting the last of the heat fade from the cup. The Bronco sat exactly where it always had, quiet, steady, unapologetic. Nothing about it had changed. But now it felt different. Not because of what it was, but because of what it had just proven. About an hour later, I heard footsteps again. Slower this time. Measured. I did not turn right away. I knew who it was before I even looked. Linda stopped a few feet from the edge of the driveway, keeping that same invisible line she had been testing all morning. No clipboard this time. No phone raised like evidence. Just her, standing there with her arms folded tighter than usual. "Ethan," she said, her voice controlled, but missing that polished edge she always carried. I turned then, setting the empty mug down on the hood. "Linda." There was a pause. Not the kind filled with tension, but the kind where someone is deciding how to say something they are not used to saying. "You embarrassed me," she said finally. Straightforward. No decoration around it. I nodded slightly, not agreeing, not disagreeing. Just acknowledging the statement for what it was. "I did not call the police," I said calmly. "You did." That landed. You could see it in the way her shoulders shifted just a fraction. She looked down at the driveway, then back up at me. "That is not the point," she replied. But there was less certainty behind it now. "The point is, this neighborhood has standards. People expect a certain look." I leaned back against the Bronco, feeling the familiar texture of worn paint under my fingertips. "Standards are fine," I said, "but they are not the same as rules. And rules are not the same as laws." She frowned slightly, like she wanted to push back, but could not quite find the angle. "You could at least be cooperative," she said. "Meet halfway." I let out a quiet breath, not frustration, just clarity. "I have been cooperative," I said. "I read the bylaws. I checked the city code. I made sure I was not breaking anything. That is cooperation. What you are asking for is control." That word sat between us heavier than anything else that had been said. Control. Linda's expression tightened again, But this time it was different. Less defensive. More reflective, even if she did not want to admit it. It is about keeping things consistent, she said, softer now. People invest a lot to live here. I nodded once. So did I. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, just honest. The kind that does not need to be filled right away. A car passed slowly at the end of the street, tires humming against asphalt, and for a second, it felt like everything had reset to something simpler. Linda looked at the Bronco again, then at the house behind me, then back at me. It just stands out, she said. I gave a small shrug. Yeah, I replied. It does. Another pause. Then she exhaled, a small, controlled release like she was letting go of something she had been holding on to longer than she realized. I will review the guidelines again, she said, almost to herself. Make sure everything is aligned. I nodded. That is probably a good place to start. She hesitated for a second longer, then gave a short, tight nod and turned back toward her house. No sharp steps this time. No urgency. Just a steady walk, heels quieter against the pavement than before. I watched her go for a moment, then looked back at the driveway, the Bronco, the line where my property met the street. Everything exactly where it had always been. The difference was not in the space. It was in the understanding of it. And sometimes, that is the only thing that actually needs to change. The next few days settled into something quieter, but not quite the same as before. It was like the neighborhood had adjusted its rhythm just slightly, the way a machine sounds after you tighten a loose bolt. Everything still worked, but now it ran smoother, more aware of itself. I kept my routine exactly the same. Same parking spot, same angle, same slow roll into the driveway at the end of the day, tires crunching over that thin line of gravel near the edge. I did not change anything, and that was the point. Because when you know you are standing on solid ground, you do not need to shift just to make someone else comfortable. The first real difference showed up 3 days later, early evening, sun dropping low enough to cast long shadows across the street. I had the garage open, tools laid out on the workbench, the familiar scent of metal and oil filling the space while I adjusted a loose bracket under the hood. That soft clink of a wrench against steel, steady and controlled, always had a way of clearing my head. Then I heard it. Not footsteps this time. A voice. Hey, Ethan. It was not Linda. I wiped my hands on a rag and stepped out, blinking slightly as my eyes adjusted to the fading light. It was Mark, the guy from 2 houses down. Mid-40s, quiet type, always gave a nod but never really stopped to talk. He stood near the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, shifting his weight like he was not used to starting conversations. Yeah, I said. He glanced at the Bronco, then back at me. That thing, it is yours, right? I almost smiled at that. Last time I checked. He let out a short breath, something between a laugh and a release of tension. Figured, he said. Listen, I saw what happened the other morning. Of course he did. Everyone did. I leaned lightly against the side of the garage, waiting. I just wanted to say, he continued, choosing his words carefully. You handled that better than I would have. I shrugged. There was nothing to handle. Just facts. He nodded, slow. Yeah, that is kind of the point. There was a pause, but it did not feel awkward. Just real. She came by my place last month, he added, glancing back toward his house. Told me my trash cans were visible for too long after pickup. Said it was a violation. I tilted my head slightly. Was it? He shook his head. No. I checked after. City ordinance says you have until evening. I had them back by noon. I could hear it in his voice now. Not anger. Frustration that had nowhere to go until recently. So what did you do? I asked. He let out a quiet breath. Move them. Sooner the next week. Figured it was easier. I nodded once. That was how it usually went. Small concessions that added up over time until you were no longer sure where your space ended and someone else's expectations began. Mark looked at the driveway again, then back at me. After seeing what happened with you, I pulled up the code myself, printed it out. That caught my attention more than anything else he had said. And I asked, and I am not doing that again, he said, a little more firmly this time. If I am within the rules, I am not moving things just because someone says so. There it was. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet shift in understanding. I nodded, a small, approving gesture. That is all it is, I said. Know where the line actually is. He gave a short nod, like something had clicked into place. Appreciate it, he said, then hesitated for a second before adding. For what it is worth, that Bronco? It is solid. Reminds me of my dad's old truck. I smiled slightly at that, running my hand along the edge of the hood. Yeah, I said. They do not make them like this anymore. He gave a small wave and headed back toward his house, steps lighter than when he walked over. I stood there for a moment, listening to the evening settle in, the hum of distant traffic blending with the quiet of the neighborhood. It was not about the truck. It was never really about the truck. It was about understanding the difference between what someone tells you and what is actually true. And once you see that clearly, it is hard to unsee it. I picked up my wrench again, the cool metal fitting into my hand like it always had, and got back to work, the steady rhythm returning, but now with a clarity that felt just a little sharper than before. It was not immediate, but once things start shifting, they rarely go back to how they were. About a week later, a white envelope showed up in my mailbox, thicker than the usual bills and flyers, with the HOA return address printed neatly in the corner. I already knew what it was before I even opened it. The paper inside had that same formal weight, the kind meant to make it feel official, like it carried more authority than it actually did. Notice of review. It read at the top, followed by a scheduled HOA meeting later that week. Subject line, clarification of vehicle and driveway use standards. I stood there by the mailbox for a second, the late afternoon sun warming the back of my neck, reading it twice just to be sure I was not misinterpreting it. This was not about enforcement anymore. This was about redefining the rules after the fact. I folded the letter slowly, slid it back into the envelope, and walked inside. The kitchen was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator, the same steady background noise that had been there the night I first read through the bylaws. Funny how things come full circle like that. I set the envelope on the table, pulled out the same stack of printed documents I had kept, and flipped through them again. HOA bylaws, city code, notes I had written in the margins, dates, times. Everything lined up exactly the same as it had before. Nothing had changed. Except now, they were trying to make it change. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 7 in the evening, held at the small clubhouse near the entrance of the neighborhood. I showed up 5 minutes early, not because I was eager, but because I like knowing where I am standing before anything starts. The room smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and old coffee, that generic community space scent that never really goes away. A few chairs were already filled. Mark sat near the back, gave me a small nod when I walked in. I nodded back and took a seat along the side wall, not front and center, not hidden either, just present. Linda stood near the front, papers in hand, speaking quietly with another board member. She looked up briefly when I entered, just long enough to register that I was there, then looked back down at her notes. No expression, just focus. At exactly 7, she stepped forward, tapping the table lightly to get attention. Thank you all for coming, she began, her voice back to that controlled, practiced tone. We are here to discuss maintaining consistency in our neighborhood standards, specifically regarding driveway usage and vehicle presentation. I listened carefully, not to react, but to understand exactly how she was framing it. Words matter in rooms like that. The way something is said can be more important than what is actually being said. She continued, outlining concerns about visual cohesion and community expectations, carefully avoiding anything that sounded like a direct accusation. It was smoother than before, more polished, like she had adjusted her approach after what happened. When she finished, she opened the floor. If anyone would like to share input, she said. There was a brief silence. Then Mark spoke up. Can you clarify what rule is being violated? He asked, his voice steady but not aggressive. Linda glanced down at her papers. This is about aligning expectations, she replied. Not necessarily addressing a specific violation, but preventing future issues. I leaned forward slightly then, resting my forearms on my knees. So there is no current rule being broken? I asked. The room shifted just a bit at that. Not tension, just attention. Linda looked at me, holding eye contact a second longer than usual. Not under the current language, she admitted. But that is what we are here to address. There it was. Clear. Simple. Out in the open. I nodded once, letting that settle. So this is about creating a new rule, I said, keeping my tone even. After confirming there is no existing issue under the current ones. A few heads in the room turned slightly, people processing that in real time. Linda's expression stayed composed, but there was a slight tightening at the corners of her mouth. It is about evolving standards, she said. Communities grow and adapt. I sat back, letting out a slow breath. Standards can evolve, I said, but they should not be built around one person's preference. Silence again. Heavier this time, but not uncomfortable. Just honest. Someone shifted in their chair. Another person nodded slightly, almost without realizing it. The conversation that followed was different from anything I had heard in that neighborhood before. Not loud, not chaotic, just people asking questions. Real ones. About where authority starts and stops. About what is enforceable and what is not. And for the first time since I moved in, it felt like the room was not being guided by one voice, but by a shared understanding that had been missing until now. The room did not get louder, but it got sharper. You could feel it in the way people leaned forward, the way small movements started to carry more weight than words. Linda stayed at the front, hands resting lightly on the table, her posture still composed, but there was a shift now. Not in control, but in position. She was no longer setting the direction. She was responding to it. A man near the front cleared his throat. I recognized him vaguely. Lived on the corner lot near the entrance. Always kept his lawn perfect, edges trimmed like they were measured with a ruler. So if there is no violation, he said, looking between Linda and the rest of the board, what exactly are we voting on? Simple question. Clean. The kind that does not leave much room to maneuver. Linda adjusted the papers in front of her, buying a second to think. We are discussing a potential update to ensure consistency moving forward, she said. The phrasing was careful, neutral, but the meaning was clear. Change the rule so that what happened before would not be allowed again. Mark spoke up again from the back, a little more confident this time. Is there a specific issue we are trying to solve, or is this just about preference? That word landed differently than anything else so far. Preference. It stripped away all the layers of formal language and left the core exposed. A few people shifted in their seats. Someone near the wall nodded slowly. Linda's expression held, but just barely. It is about maintaining a certain standard, she replied. I could hear the repetition now. Same idea, different wording, circling the same point without ever grounding it. I leaned forward again, not rushing, just choosing the moment carefully. Standards matter, I said, but they need to be clear, consistent, and applied equally. Otherwise, they are not standards. They are opinions. The room went still for a second. Not frozen. Focused. The difference is important. Linda looked directly at me, and for the first time. Since all of this started, there was no edge in it. Just calculation. Are you suggesting we should not improve our guidelines? She asked. I shook my head slightly. I am suggesting that guidelines should solve real problems, not create new ones. A woman sitting 2 rows over raised her hand slightly, then spoke without waiting to be called. I moved here because I thought the rules were clear, she said. If we start changing them every time someone does not like something, how do we know what is stable? That question carried further than anything else in the room. Stability. That was what people actually cared about. Not the color of a vehicle or the angle of a driveway. Predictability. Knowing where the line is and trusting that it will not move without reason. Linda glanced down at her notes again, then back up. We are not trying to create instability, she said, but the confidence was thinner now. Another voice joined in, this one from the side. Then why now? The man asked. Why is this suddenly an issue? No one answered right away. They did not need to. Everyone in that room knew exactly why now. Because something had been tested, and it did not hold up. I sat back in my chair, letting the conversation move without me for a moment. This was no longer about me. That was the part that mattered most. It had moved beyond a single driveway, a single vehicle, a single interaction. It had become about how decisions were made, and more importantly, why. Linda finally set her papers down completely, hands flat on the table, a small but noticeable shift. It seems like there is concern about how this is being approached, she said. So perhaps we need to revisit the proposal. There was a subtle release in the room, not relief, but recognition. Something had been acknowledged without needing to be forced. Mark glanced over at me, just for a second, then back toward the front. He did not say anything, but he did not need to. The conversation continued, but the tone had changed. Less directive, more collaborative. Questions instead of statements. Clarifications instead of assumptions. And through all of it, one thing stayed consistent. No one mentioned my driveway again. Not directly, not indirectly. It was no longer the focus, because it had never really been the problem. By the time the meeting wrapped up, the original proposal had not been approved. Not rejected outright, just set aside. Deferred. The kind of outcome that tells you something important without making a big show of it. People stood up slowly, chairs scraping lightly against the floor, conversations starting in low voices as they filtered toward the exit. I stepped outside into the night air, cooler now, carrying that faint scent of grass and pavement that always settles in after sunset. The streetlights cast long, soft pools of light across the sidewalk, and for a moment, everything felt still again. Not because nothing had happened, but because what needed to happen already had. And sometimes, that is all it takes to change the direction of something without ever raising your voice. The walk back from the clubhouse felt longer than it should have, not because of distance, but because of how quiet everything had become. The kind of quiet that is not empty, just settled. Streetlights stretched across the pavement in soft yellow lines, and the air carried that faint evening coolness that always shows up right when the day finally lets go. I could hear my own footsteps against the sidewalk, steady, unhurried, the same rhythm I had walked with since the day I moved in. Nothing about the neighborhood had physically changed. Same houses, same lawns, same driveways lined up like they had been measured out with precision. But something underneath it had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough that you could feel it if you paid attention. When I reached my place, the Bronco was exactly where I had left it earlier that day, sitting in the driveway under the soft glow of the porch light. The paint still worn, the edges still imperfect, the same quiet presence it had always been. I stood there for a second, keys in my hand, just looking at it. Not because I had not seen it 1,000 times before, but because now it carried a different weight. Not as an object, as a line that had been tested and held. I walked up, ran my hand along the side, feeling the familiar texture under my fingertips, the small imperfections that told its story better than any polish ever could. Inside, the house was still, the kind of stillness that comes from a place that is yours and only yours. I set my keys down on the counter, the soft clink echoing lightly, and poured a glass of water, the sound of it filling the glass cutting clean through the silence. Simple things, ordinary things, the kind that do not feel like much until you realize how important they are when someone tries to step into them. The next morning, everything moved like it always did. Coffee brewing, sunlight creeping through the blinds, the low hum of the neighborhood waking up. I stepped outside with my mug, the air crisp, carrying that faint mix of grass and pavement that always comes with early hours. The Bronco sat where it always sat. I took a sip, leaned against the edge of the porch, and just listened. No tension, no expectation, just space. A few minutes later, I noticed movement across the street. Linda stepped out of her house, papers in hand, her usual routine starting up again. But this time, something was different. She glanced in my direction, not quickly, not avoiding it, just a normal look. No pause, no measuring, no calculation behind it, just acknowledgement. I gave a small nod, nothing exaggerated, just enough to recognize the moment for what it was. She nodded back, equally simple, then continued down the sidewalk. That was it. No words, no confrontation, no attempt to reclaim ground that was never hers to begin with. Just a boundary understood without needing to be argued again. Over the next few days, the neighborhood settled into a new version of itself. People still kept their lawns trimmed, still followed the rules that were actually written. But there was less pressure, less of that invisible weight that comes from someone watching too closely. Mark left his trash cans out until the evening without rushing to move them. No one said a word. A couple of neighbors started parking in their driveways the way they preferred, not the way they thought they were supposed to. Small things, quiet things, but they added up. One evening, as I was closing the garage, Mark walked by again, hands in his pockets like before. "Looks like things calmed down," he said. I nodded. They usually do when people understand where the line is. He gave a small smile. Funny how that works. I glanced back at the driveway, then at the street beyond it. "Not really," I said. "It is just easier to follow something when it is real." He nodded once, like that made more sense than anything else that had been said all week, then continued on his way. I shut off the garage light, the click echoing softly, and stood there for a second longer, looking at the space in front of me. Same driveway, same truck, same house. But now there was no question attached to any of it. And that was the part that mattered. Not winning, not proving someone wrong, just knowing, without doubt, that what is yours does not need permission to exist. And once that becomes clear, everything else tends to fall into place exactly where it belongs.